In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the horizon meets eternity and silence reigns supreme, a single voice would shatter the expectations of an entire naval fleet. What began as a routine military exercise would transform into a moment that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Sometimes, the most extraordinary stories emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and sometimes, a voice carries more power than the roar of jet engines cutting through the sky. Lieutenant Sarah Chen never imagined that her emergency distress call would halt two F-18 Super Hornets in mid-intercept, leaving seasoned fighter pilots speechless over their communications systems. What happened that day above the carrier fleet would challenge everything the military thought they knew about protocol, human connection, and the unexpected moments that remind us of our shared humanity even in the midst of military precision. This is the true story of how one woman's voice, transmitted through crackling radio waves 30,000 feet above the ocean, would freeze two of the Navy's most elite pilots in their tracks and change the course of what was supposed to be a standard training operation. It's a story about courage, vulnerability, and the profound impact that genuine human emotion can have even in the most disciplined and structured environments imaginable. Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her headset as the twin engines of the C-2 Greyhound cargo aircraft hummed steadily beneath her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Ocean, creating a mesmerizing pattern of light and dark that stretched endlessly in all directions. She had made this flight dozens of times before, transporting personnel and supplies between naval bases, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the unusual clarity of the sky, or perhaps the nervous energy she had been carrying since receiving her new assignment orders the previous evening. Sarah was 26 years old, a communications officer with 3 years of active duty service under her belt. She had grown up in a small town in Oregon where her father worked as a radio technician for the local fire department. From an early age, she had been fascinated by the way voices could travel through invisible waves, connecting people across vast distances. Her childhood was filled with hours spent listening to her father test radio equipment, learning the intricate dance of frequencies and signals that made communication possible. The decision to join the Navy had come naturally to her. She wanted to see the world, to be part of something bigger than herself, and to use her skills in communications to serve her country. The rigorous training had been challenging, but Sarah had excelled in every aspect of her duties. Her superiors often praised her calm demeanor under pressure and her ability to maintain clear communication, even in the most chaotic situations. Today's flight was supposed to be routine. She was accompanying a small team of technicians who were being transported to the USS Abraham Lincoln, where they would install new communication equipment. The carrier was currently positioned about 200 miles off the coast of California, participating in a large-scale training exercise involving multiple naval vessels and aircraft squadrons. As the Greyhound approached the coordinates of the carrier group, Sarah could see the impressive sight of the fleet spread out across the ocean. The massive aircraft carrier sat at the center like a floating city, surrounded by destroyers, cruisers, and support vessels arranged in a protective formation. Even from their current altitude, the scale of the operation was breathtaking. Captain Rodriguez, the pilot of their aircraft, came over the intercom with his usual professional tone. "We're beginning our approach to the Lincoln. Weather conditions are optimal, and we should have you folks on deck in about 20 minutes. Sarah nodded to herself and began reviewing the equipment manifest one final time. The new communication systems they were delivering would significantly upgrade the carrier's ability to coordinate with other vessels and aircraft during complex operations. It was exactly the kind of work that made her feel proud to be serving in the Navy. Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above the fleet, two F-18 Super Hornets were conducting their own training exercise. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison and Lieutenant Alex Rivera were seasoned fighter pilots, each with over 8 years of flight experience and multiple deployment tours. They had been tasked with practicing intercept procedures, using the approaching cargo plane as a simulated target for their exercise. Morrison, the senior pilot, was known throughout his squadron for his precision flying and unflappable demeanor. He had earned his nickname Ice during his first deployment, when he had successfully landed a damaged aircraft on a carrier deck during a severe storm. Rivera, younger but equally skilled, was considered one of the most promising pilots in the fleet. Together, they formed an exceptionally effective team. "Control, this is Falcon 1, Morrison radioed to the carrier. "We have visual contact with the incoming Greyhound. Beginning intercept approach is briefed." The exercise was straightforward. They would approach the cargo plane from different angles, practice various intercept maneuvers, and then escort it safely to the carrier. It was the kind of routine training that both pilots could perform in their sleep, but they approached it with the same professionalism they brought to every mission. As they moved into position, Rivera noticed something unusual about the Greyhound's flight path. "Falcon 1. Are you seeing what I'm seeing?"
The cargo bird seems to be deviating slightly from its planned approach vector.
Morrison confirmed the observation. Roger that, Falcon 2. Control, are you tracking any course deviation on the incoming Greyhound? The air traffic control officer aboard the Lincoln checked his instruments. Negative, Falcon 1.
The Greyhound appears to be maintaining its filed flight plan from our perspective. What neither the pilots nor the air traffic controller realized was that the Greyhound was indeed beginning to experience a subtle but serious problem. A gradual loss of hydraulic pressure was affecting the aircraft's control systems, making it increasingly difficult for Captain Rodriguez to maintain precise control of the aircraft. Inside the cargo plane, Sarah was the first to notice something was wrong. As someone trained to pay attention to the smallest details in communication and technical systems, she had developed an acute awareness of the subtle changes that often preceded larger problems. The vibration pattern of the aircraft had changed slightly, and she could hear a faint but unusual sound coming from somewhere in the aircraft's mechanical systems. She unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way forward to the cockpit, where Captain Rodriguez and his co-pilot were intently studying their instrument panel. "Captain, is everything operating normally?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady.
Rodriguez looked up from the controls with a slight frown. "We're experiencing some hydraulic pressure irregularities, Lieutenant. Nothing critical yet, but we're monitoring the situation closely." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her training kicked in immediately. "Is there anything I can do to assist? I have extensive experience with aircraft communication systems." "Actually, yes," the co-pilot replied. "We may need to communicate our status to the carrier if this situation develops further. Having someone with your communications expertise available could be very helpful." As if on cue, the hydraulic pressure warning light began flashing on the instrument panel. Rodriguez's expression became more serious as he checked his readings. "We're definitely losing hydraulic pressure.
It's gradual but consistent. We need to notify the Lincoln immediately." The captain reached for his radio, but as he began to transmit, a burst of static filled the cockpit. The communication system was experiencing interference, possibly related to the hydraulic problems affecting other aircraft systems. "Lincoln Control, this is Greyhound 7-4. We are experiencing..." The transmission cut out completely. Rodriguez tried again, but the radio seemed to be malfunctioning. "I decided to get for me to meet up and tell him seconds happened. This is the book, it's about history." "Rodriguez is down," he said grimly. "Lieutenant Chen, we're going to need your expertise now." Sarah quickly moved to the aircraft's backup communication station, a more sophisticated system that she was intimately familiar with from her training. As she powered up the equipment and began checking frequencies, she could feel the aircraft's handling becoming increasingly unstable. The pilots were working harder to maintain control, and she could hear the strain in their voices as they communicated with each other. "The backup system is coming online," Sarah reported. "I should be able to establish contact with the carrier in just a moment." Above them, Morrison and Rivera continued their intercept exercise, unaware of the developing emergency below. They had positioned themselves on either side of the Greyhound and were practicing various tactical approaches when Rivera noticed something that made him look more closely at the cargo plane.
"Falcon 1, the Greyhound's flight characteristics look unusual."
"The aircraft seems to be experiencing some kind of control difficulties." Morrison immediately focused his attention on the cargo plane and confirmed Rivera's observation. "You're right, Falcon 2. Something's not right down there. Control, we need to break off the exercise and investigate the status of the Greyhound." The air traffic controller aboard the Lincoln was becoming concerned as well.
"Falcon 1, we've been unable to establish radio contact with Greyhound 7-4 for the past several minutes. Can you make visual contact and assess their situation?" "Roger that, Control." Moving in for closer visual inspection. As Morrison and Rivera adjusted their flight paths to get a better view of the cargo plane, Sarah was working frantically to establish communication using the backup radio system. The equipment was more complex than the standard radio, but she had trained extensively on this type of system and knew its capabilities well. Finally, she managed to establish a clear channel. But as she prepared to make her first transmission, the gravity of their situation hit her fully. They were losing altitude gradually. The hydraulic problems were worsening, and they were still miles from the safety of the carrier deck. The professional composure she had maintained throughout her military career suddenly felt fragile in the face of this very real emergency. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the microphone. In that moment, all the training in the world couldn't completely suppress the very human fear that was beginning to build inside her. She took a deep breath, knowing that her ability to communicate their situation clearly could mean the difference between a successful emergency landing and a disaster. Lincoln Control, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen aboard Greyhound 74. She began, her voice carrying a mixture of professional training and unmistakable human vulnerability.
We are experiencing a hydraulic emergency and require immediate assistance. What happened next would change everything for everyone listening to that transmission. The moment Sarah's voice came through the radio, something extraordinary happened that no one in the air or on the carrier could have anticipated. Her transmission carried more than just the technical details of their emergency. There was something in the quality of her voice, the way she managed to maintain professional clarity while allowing just enough of her genuine fear and determination to come through, that stopped everyone listening in their tracks.
Lieutenant Commander Morrison had heard thousands of radio transmissions throughout his military career. He had listened to pilots in combat, sailors in distress, and countless routine communications that filled the airways during naval operations.
But something about Sarah's voice was different. It wasn't just the words she was saying or the information she was conveying. There was a quality to her communication that spoke directly to something deeper than military protocol or professional training. Copy that, Greyhound 74. The air traffic controller aboard the Lincoln responded immediately.
We're reading your emergency. Can you describe the nature and severity of your hydraulic problems? Sarah's response came through with remarkable clarity considering the circumstances.
Lincoln Control, we've lost approximately 60% of our hydraulic pressure over the past 10 minutes. The loss appears to be gradual but consistent. Captain Rodriguez reports that aircraft control is becoming increasingly difficult, particularly with altitude and heading maintenance. As she spoke, Morrison found himself unconsciously slowing his approach to the cargo plane.
There was something about the way she was handling the emergency communication that impressed him profoundly.
Despite the obvious stress of the situation, her voice remained clear and informative. She was providing exactly the information that the carrier would need to coordinate an emergency response, but she was doing it in a way that somehow conveyed both her professional competence and her very human awareness of the danger they were facing. Rivera, flying in formation beside Morrison, was having a similar reaction. Falcon 1. Are you hearing what I'm hearing in that transmission? Roger that, Falcon 2.
There's something remarkable about how she's handling this emergency communication.
What neither pilot initially realized was that Sarah's voice was affecting them so strongly because it represented something they rarely encountered in their highly structured military environment.
Here was someone who was managing to be completely professional and utterly human at the same time.
She wasn't hiding her fear, but she wasn't letting it control her either. She was simply being authentic while fulfilling her duties with exceptional skill. Aboard the Greyhound, the situation was becoming more critical by the minute. Captain Rodriguez was struggling to maintain control as the hydraulic systems continued to fail. The aircraft was losing altitude more rapidly now, and the approach to the carrier was going to be far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Lieutenant Chen, Rodriguez called over his shoulder. We need to communicate our approach requirements to the Lincoln. With these control problems, we're going to need emergency equipment standing by and possibly a clear deck for an emergency landing. Sarah immediately got back on the radio. Lincoln Control, Greyhound 74, requesting priority approach with full emergency protocols. We anticipate control difficulties during landing approach and may require emergency deck clearing. The response from the Lincoln came back quickly. Greyhound 74 emergency protocols are being implemented. We're clearing the deck and positioning emergency equipment. Can you maintain current altitude for approach? Negative, Lincoln Control, Sarah responded, and for the first time, a note of real concern crept into her voice.
We're continuing to lose altitude.
Captain Rodriguez estimates we'll need to begin our approach in the next 8 minutes regardless of our preferred timing. Morrison and Rivera exchanged glances through their aircraft canopies. They both recognized the implications of what they were hearing. The cargo plane was in serious trouble, and the people aboard were facing a genuinely dangerous situation. Control, this is Falcon 1. Morrison radioed to the carrier. Request permission to escort Greyhound 74 during their emergency approach. We can provide visual assessment and communication relay if needed. Permission granted, Falcon 1. Position yourselves to assist as needed. As the two fighter jets moved into escort positions around the struggling cargo plane, Morrison made a decision that went beyond standard protocol. Greyhound 74, this is Lieutenant Commander Morrison in Falcon 1. My wingman and I are positioning to escort you in. How are you folks doing up there? Sarah's response surprised everyone listening.
Thank you, Falcon 1.
That means more than you might realize. We're managing the situation as best we can, but I have to admit this is more excitement than we bargained for today. There was something about the honesty in her response that hit Morrison like a physical impact.
In their world of military precision and carefully controlled emotions, hearing someone acknowledge their fear while continuing to do their job with such competence was both refreshing and deeply moving.
Rivera found himself moved by the exchange as well. Greyhound 7-4, this is Falcon 2.
We've got you covered. You're doing an outstanding job with your emergency communications. Thank you, Falcon 2, Sarah replied. It's reassuring to know we have such capable escort. I have to say your voices are the most welcome sound we've heard all day. The conversation continued as the aircraft approached the carrier, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between the military personnel involved. What had started as routine training exercise had become something much more personal and human. Morrison realized that he was hearing something in Sarah's voice that he hadn't experienced in years of military service. Despite the emergency situation, despite the professional requirements of her communication duties, she was allowing her genuine personality to come through. She was being real in a way that was both completely appropriate and utterly refreshing.
Greyhound 7-4, what's your background in communications? Morrison found himself asking, genuinely curious about the person behind the voice. I've been working in naval communications for 3 years. Falcon 1. Before that, I grew up around radio equipment thanks to my father's work. I've always been fascinated by the way voices can connect people across distances.
Well, your communication skills are exceptional, Morrison responded. You're handling this emergency with remarkable professionalism.
I have to admit, having your support makes this whole situation feel much more manageable. Rivera was listening to this exchange with growing amazement. In all his years of military service, he had never heard a conversation quite like this one. The woman in the cargo plane was managing to be completely professional while also being completely human, and it was having an effect on everyone involved that went far beyond the technical requirements of the situation. As they continued toward the carrier, Sarah maintained constant communication with both the Lincoln and the escort fighters. Her updates were precise and informative, but they were also infused with a quality that made everyone listening feel like they were part of something important and meaningful.
Lincoln Control. Greyhound 7-4 is beginning final approach. Hydraulic pressure has stabilized at approximately 30%. Captain Rodriguez reports that control response is sluggish but manageable for landing. Copy that, Greyhound 7-4. Emergency crews are in position. Wind is calm. Deck is clear. You're cleared for emergency landing. Morrison and Rivera maintained their escort positions as the cargo plane lined up for its approach to the carrier deck. Both pilots found themselves more invested in the outcome of this emergency than they had ever been in a training exercise. Falcon 1 and 2, this is Greyhound 7-4. Sarah's voice came through the radio one more time as they approached the carrier. I want you both to know how much your escort has meant to us. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, knowing you were there made all the difference. Morrison felt something catch in his throat as he responded. The pleasure has been ours, Greyhound 7-4. You've shown us what real professionalism and grace under pressure look like. As the cargo plane touched down on the carrier deck in a landing that was rougher than normal but ultimately successful, both fighter pilots found themselves changed by the experience. They had witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration of how being genuinely human could actually enhance professional performance rather than detract from it. The emergency was over, but the impact of Sarah's voice and her approach to communication under pressure would stay with everyone involved for much longer than anyone could have imagined. The hours following the emergency landing were unlike anything anyone aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln had experienced during a routine training exercise. As the cargo plane came to a stop on the carrier deck, emergency crews immediately surrounded the aircraft to ensure everyone aboard was safe and to begin assessing the extent of the hydraulic damage that had caused the crisis. Sarah Chen stepped off the Greyhound onto the carrier deck feeling a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something she couldn't quite identify. The successful landing had ended the immediate danger, but the intensity of the experience and the connections she had made through her radio communications during the emergency had left her feeling emotionally stirred in a way she hadn't expected.
Captain Rodriguez and his co-pilot were immediately debriefed by the carrier's flight operations team while the maintenance crews began examining the aircraft to determine exactly what had caused the hydraulic failure. The technical analysis would take several hours, but initial inspections suggested that a gradual seal failure in the hydraulic system had led to the pressure loss that made the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Morrison and Lieutenant Rivera had landed their F-18s and were going through their own post-flight procedures. Both pilots found themselves still thinking about the emergency they had just witnessed and the remarkable way the communications officer aboard the cargo plane had handled the situation.
I've been flying for 8 years, Morrison said to Rivera as they walked across the flight deck, and I've never heard anything quite like that radio communication. Rivera nodded in agreement. There was something about her voice and the way she handled the emergency that was just, I don't know how to describe it.
Professional but real at the same time.
What neither pilot realized was that their conversation was being overheard by Commander Patricia Hayes, the carrier's executive officer, who had been monitoring the emergency response from the bridge. Commander Hayes was a veteran naval officer with over 20 years of experience, and she had been struck by the same qualities in Sarah's communication that had impressed the fighter pilots.
Gentlemen, Commander Hayes approached Morrison and Rivera. I couldn't help but overhear your comments about the emergency communication we just witnessed. I have to say I was equally impressed by Lieutenant Chen's performance under pressure. Morrison turned to face the commander. Ma'am, in all honesty, it was remarkable to listen to. She managed to maintain complete professionalism while still being genuinely human. It made all the difference in how we approached our escort duties.
Commander Hayes nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to meet with Lieutenant Chen once she's completed her immediate post-emergency requirements. What we witnessed today might have some important implications for how we think about crisis communication throughout the fleet. An hour later, Sarah found herself sitting in Commander Hayes' office aboard the carrier, still somewhat overwhelmed by the events of the day. She had expected a routine debriefing about the emergency, but Commander Hayes seemed interested in discussing something much broader. Lieutenant Chen, Commander Hayes began, your communication during today's emergency was exceptional, and not just from a technical standpoint. You managed to convey critical information clearly and efficiently, but you also did something that I rarely see in military communications. You remained genuinely human throughout the crisis.
Sarah wasn't entirely sure how to respond. Thank you, ma'am. I tried to follow my training while also being honest about our situation.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, Commander Hayes continued. Your honesty and authenticity actually enhanced your professional performance. The fighter pilots escorting you were more engaged and supportive because they could hear that you were a real person dealing with a real emergency, not just a voice reading from a script. As their conversation continued, Sarah began to understand that what she had done during the emergency was being viewed as something significant by the senior officers aboard the carrier. Her approach to crisis communication had apparently demonstrated something important about the value of authentic human connection even within the highly structured environment of military operations. Meanwhile, word about the emergency and Sarah's exceptional communication during the crisis was spreading throughout the carrier. The audio recording of her radio transmissions was being reviewed by communications specialists and senior officers, who were all impressed by the same qualities that had struck Morrison and Rivera during the actual emergency. Captain James Mitchell, the carrier's commanding officer, requested a meeting with Sarah later that afternoon. When she arrived at his office, she found Commander Hayes and 2 other senior communications officers already present. Lieutenant Chen, Captain Mitchell began, I've reviewed the audio from today's emergency, and I want you to know that your communication skills during that crisis were truly outstanding.
But more than that, I think what you demonstrated today has important implications for how we train our personnel in crisis communication. Sarah listened as Captain Mitchell explained that her approach during the emergency had shown how authentic human connection could actually improve the effectiveness of professional military communication rather than compromise it.
The way she had managed to be both completely professional and genuinely human had enhanced rather than detracted from her ability to coordinate the emergency response. We'd like you to consider developing a training program based on what you demonstrated today. Commander Hayes added, your ability to maintain professional competence while allowing your genuine personality to come through could be incredibly valuable for other communications personnel throughout the fleet. Over the next several days as the carrier group continued its training exercises, Sarah found herself working with senior communications specialists to analyze what had made her emergency communications so effective. They identified several key factors: her technical competence, her emotional honesty, her ability to maintain clarity under pressure, and most importantly, her willingness to be genuinely human while fulfilling her professional duties. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and Lieutenant Rivera made a point of seeking Sarah out during her time aboard the carrier. The 3 of them spent several hours discussing the emergency and what it had meant to all of them. I have to tell you, Morrison said during one of their conversations, listening to your voice during that emergency reminded me of why I became a pilot in the first place. There was something about your communication that made the whole situation feel like it mattered on a human level, not just a technical one. Rivera agreed. You managed to make all of us feel like we were part of something important and meaningful. That's not something you can learn from a manual. The Sarah was moved by their comments,
But she was also beginning to understand that what had happened during the emergency had been significant for everyone involved, not just herself. Her willingness to be authentic had apparently given the other military personnel permission to be more human in their own responses, creating a level of connection and cooperation that went beyond normal professional requirements. 6 months later, the training program that Sarah had developed based on her emergency communication experience was being implemented throughout the Pacific Fleet.
The program, officially called Authentic Professional Communication Under Crisis, focused on teaching military personnel how to maintain technical competence and professional standards while also allowing their genuine humanity to enhance their communication effectiveness. The program was groundbreaking because it challenged the traditional military assumption that professional communication required emotional detachment.
Sarah's experience had demonstrated that authentic human connection could actually improve professional performance, especially during crisis situations, when genuine human support and cooperation were most critical. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was one of the first pilots to go through Sarah's training program, and he later became one of its strongest advocates.
What Lieutenant Chen taught us, he would often tell other pilots, is that being genuinely human doesn't make you less professional. It makes you more effective because people respond better when they know there's a real person behind the voice on the radio.
The impact of Sarah's emergency communication extended far beyond the development of a training program. Her experience became a case study that was discussed in military academies and professional development courses throughout the armed services.
The story of how her voice had frozen 2 fighter pilots, not through fear or confusion, but through the power of authentic human connection, became an example of how individual authenticity could enhance rather than compromise professional excellence. 3 years after the emergency, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant commander and was assigned to lead the Navy's new Center for Human-Centered Communication Excellence. Her work had shown that the most advanced technology and the most rigorous training could be enhanced rather than replaced by genuine human connection and authentic communication. The fighter pilots who had escorted her during that emergency remained in contact with Sarah throughout their careers. Morrison often said that listening to her voice during the crisis had changed his entire approach to military leadership, making him more aware of the human element in all professional interactions. For Sarah herself, the experience had revealed something important about the nature of professional excellence. She had learned that being completely competent and completely human were not contradictory goals but complementary ones. Her willingness to be authentic during the emergency had not only saved lives, but had also demonstrated a new model for how military personnel could serve, with both professional excellence and genuine humanity.
The story of the voice that stopped fighter jets in mid-flight had become more than just an account of a successful emergency response. It had become a demonstration of how individual authenticity and professional competence could combine to create something more powerful and effective than either quality could achieve alone.
Years later, whenever young communications officers asked Sarah for advice about developing their professional skills, she would always tell them about that day above the Pacific when she learned that the most powerful communication tool in any crisis is simply being genuinely human while doing your job with complete competence. The emergency had lasted less than an hour, but its impact on military communication training and the careers of everyone involved would continue for decades to come.